Thank you very much, Julia. And thank you very much all for being here today. We really appreciate your time and attention. I'm just going to jump into it, if that's all right. So, in a 2011 blog in the New York Times, the journalist Andrew Revkin suggested that the seemingly unequivocal term extinction raises a lot more questions than it possibly has the capacity to answer. Most of us would probably define extinction in our minds in quite broad terms as the death of the last individual member of a species. But what we're here to propose to you today, and what is increasingly clear through our research, is that that definition is very inadequate on a number of fronts.
Yeah, so as introduced, both Trina and I are affiliated with the doctoral training programme in extinction studies at the University of Leeds. So this is a programme of about 20 doctoral students, which Graham, who couldn't be here today unfortunately, helped direct in the years leading up to his retirement. Broadly speaking, the programme looks to combine both cultural and biological approaches to extinction, not just to look at different possible ways of understanding it, but to consider different possible ways of addressing it in our extinction-tainted age. Today, we'll both be sharing some insights on the politics of the word extinction. What is in it as a concept, what are its implications, and how differently can we imagine extinction or near extinction?
In my first half of the talk, I'm going to explain the harms which I argue are created by mainstream extinction discourses, how they victimise communities who are affected by climate change in the international frameworks governing the climate crisis, international sort of legislation like loss and damage. These discourses, which epistemically and legally govern our understanding of who is affected by extinction and climate crisis, have grown up largely without recognising the agency, autonomy and adaptation of individuals who are most affected by climate change.
I will then build on this discussion by offering an alternative way of thinking about the extinction crisis from the perspective of a Maori writer. By exploring Indigenous literature as a mode of critical inquiry, I will investigate how writers from climate-affected communities might convey existential threats, not through a narrative of tragic decline or sudden apocalypse, but through a very ordinary story about the everyday encounters between and adaptations of human and non-human beings.
The word extinction has primarily been used with reference to the more than human. We often associate it with species decline. But narratives of crisis, extinction and decline have expanded in recent decades as existential threats from climate change increasingly gravely affect humanity. In my part of this short lunchtime talk, I want to reflect on the implications of those discourses. In particular, what kind of subjects and people do we imagine when we cocoon communities in a language of crisis and extinction threat? As you can see from the board, I'm going to explore this primarily through the idea of loss and damage, which, for clarity, is the emerging area of climate law which intends to recognise, address and compensate the impacts of climate change. Loss and damage is, as a result, the area of international climate law which is most closely tied to extinction, because it's quite literally intended to govern what is being lost. For the avoidance of doubt, I thought I'd start with a couple of definitions. So throughout this talk, a couple of times I'll refer to the IPCC and the UNFCCC. I'm sure you're very aware with the terms, but for clarity's sake, the IPCC is the international scientific body that's kind of the expert panel on climate change, and the UNFCCC is the international governance architectures for climate change. So when you hear about COP29, COP30, that's the meeting of the parties of the UNFCCC. In that scientific parlance of the IPCC and those legal structures of the UNFCCC, loss and damage is tied by definition to the idea of particularly vulnerable communities. These are communities which, by virtue of their geography and their socioeconomic underdevelopment, are more exposed to climatic hazards, more vulnerable to harms from them, and less able to cope with the effects. Specifically, these particularly vulnerable areas are understood to be least developed countries and small island developing states. I'm going to refer to small island developing states by their acronym going forward, which is SIDS. Again, just a little definition to start us off. So since COP27 in 2022 established the Loss and Damage Fund, that is the financing body which is intended to pay for programmes which address and compensate losses and damages, these discourses have become more prominent and influential. Central to advocacy for loss and damage is the recognition of climate change's effects on the global south, the ecological debt owed from the global north to the global south, and the idea of climate justice. And all of those are essential to advancing equitable climate action. However, in the next few minutes, I'd like to propose that the discourses of vulnerability, extinction threat, and disaster which surround loss and damage have also served to create imaginaries of weak, vulnerable, and passive legal subjects of loss and damage governance, and that those subjects are essentially wrong. In 2023, the scholar Charlotte Wetherill argued that SIDS are made vulnerable in loss and damage discourses, in which they are legally framed as being proximate to extinction. IPCC reports on climate impacts since 1992, for example, have dedicated a lot of attention to SIDS. These reports often use beautiful photos of island states as their cover image, presented as these sort of tragically beautiful, soon-to-be lost paradises. Photos like the kind of background image on that slide there. As you can see in the second quote on the board from the IPCC, these reports also tend to restate SIDS' uniquely high level of vulnerability. And while language like that rightly recognises the significance of the threat posed by climate change to SIDS, it defines them in terms of their anticipated loss. This is also reflected in the language surrounding other particularly vulnerable areas of the world. Chaturvedi and Doyle argued in 2015 that Bangladesh, for example, is understood in UNFCCC discourses, thank you, as a climate change black hole, due to this quite abstract prediction that its citizens will soon be displaced by climate-related hazards. You can see on my slide here a Government of Bangladesh report from 2009, I think, which threatens, again, the quite abstract idea of 20 million environmental refugees from Bangladesh in the near future. It doesn't define environmental refugee. The report gives very little explanation as to how this is going to come about. And while it's not my intention at all to deny the seriousness of climate change for the country, I would argue that these discourses are shaping worldviews of Bangladesh, as Chaturvedi and Doyle also argue in their book. And these discourses kind of frame Bangladesh as a site and source of fear, instability, and disruption due to climate change. With this in mind, it's maybe unsurprising that the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage also frames particularly vulnerable countries in quite passive terms. As you can see from the final quote on the slide there, the Loss and Damage Fund frames climate-affected states as victims in need of assistance, rather than as states who are rightly owed reparations, or even as collaborators, equal partners, pioneers in climate action. This conservative language is partly due to the cautiousness of colonial nations to acknowledge their responsibility for climate change. Yet the legal language of assistance continues to naturalise what I call the vulnerabilisation of these countries. Charlotte Wetherill also uses that word in her article. And it understands them as sites of disaster, headed for extinction without space for autonomous resistance. Once again, just to emphasise, this talk, of course, is not intended to deny the fact that climate change poses an incredible danger to these communities, and indeed communities the world over. It does. But I want to touch on the implications of defining communities in terms of their vulnerability and extinction threat. Firstly, I'd like to argue that these discourses risk naturalising and normalising, rather than problematising and questioning, the vulnerability of communities affected by loss and damage. For example, the establishment of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage since 2022 has not been paired with an emboldening of greenhouse gas emission reduction. Rather, particularly with the second administration of Donald Trump, it's coincided with a global rollback on attention to mitigation. For context, a very recent example of this is the Conservative Party in the UK, which is in theory the major opposition party in the UK, has recently tabled the idea of withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. It's really a moment at which mitigation action is very weak rather than very strong. And if the fund for responding to loss and damage is not accompanied by a radical mitigation of CO2 emissions, it risks accommodating climate change, accepting it will cause harm, rather than resisting it. Hand in hand with these discourses around particularly vulnerable communities, which I've explored here today, I would argue that these discourses around the fund for responding to loss and damage are not necessarily rallying and emboldening resistance, but rather risk presuming that extinction is an inexorable direction of travel. These legal documents, these policy documents, have a significant hand in naturalising the disempowerment and loss of climate-affected communities. They almost accept that climatic harms are going to happen by framing the loss of SIDS and displacement of peoples as inevitable, but not doing anything to mobilise action to prevent it. At its worst, then, the spectre of climate-related extinction is treated as a foregone conclusion. Secondly, as shown in the UNFCCC quote on the previous slide, these discourses present the subjects of loss and damage governance as needing assistance from the wealthy and secure global north. These weak imagined subjects in need of assistance in loss and damage governance are cruelly ironic, because the Loss and Damage Fund has only emerged from the advocacy, pioneering, political thought and intensely hard work of actors from SIDS and least developed countries themselves. And so this understanding of the legal subjects of loss and damage as quite passive is not only unjust, but it also furnishes a very inaccurate understanding of what losses and damages are themselves. In my research, I partnered with one community in Malawi with whom I conducted data collection about losses and damages in 2024. It's really the backbone of my PhD. And this community, pictured on the slide here, all photographs I took last year with them, is called Tembedza. And Tembedza has been affected by recurrent cyclones and droughts in the past 5 years. In Tembedza, you could not understand losses and damages without recognising the resistance of the people living there. In response to the awful agricultural conditions which are caused by climate change in Tembedza, people engaged in a huge number of coping mechanisms, which ranged from the largely positive, like mutual aid, to the highly destructive, like childhood marriage. These coping mechanisms are integral to the landscape of losses and damages in Tembedza. They both enable collaborative possibilities, and they also create new harms. If the Loss and Damage Fund is to finance effective, equitable programmes to address loss and damage, it's essential that such programmes work within the existing autonomous responses of local communities. And I would argue that to do so, communities have to be understood as agents and partners rather than victims. The word extinction does vital work in forcing global attention to environmental and climate crisis. However, these words, extinction, crisis, disaster, vulnerability, they need to be deployed with care and selectively. When overused and readily applied to individuals who have little other visibility in international governance, these discourses can create new harms through the legal subjects they imagine. To understand the threats facing climate vulnerable and climate affected communities, then, one must understand such communities through their own languages, framings, and stories, approaching legal narratives which are made about them rather than with them, with very critical eyes. With all of that in mind, in what follows, Anisha will explore one way of rethinking mainstream extinction discourses through an examination of Kerry Hume's short story, Floating Words.
Thank you, Trina. Yes, so we'll be shifting gears a little bit now as I will move from the legal realm, in which Trina is an expert, to the more literary realm. And I will be exploring a potential subversion of, and thus alternative to, these discourses that Trina has been critiquing. So to do this, I'll be talking about what I call near-extinction narratives to explore depictions of climate adaptation in Maori literature. I don't really have the space today to fully unpack what I mean by near-extinction or near-extinction narratives, and this is kind of an ever-evolving concept in my own PhD work. But what I can make clear is that when I talk about near extinction, I'm not talking about the final death of a species. I'm referring to that liminal space-time between life and death, in which a species, for reasons of climate change, habitat destruction, exploitation, or invasive species, is being pushed towards extinction, towards the edge of life itself. The term near extinction, then, in many ways functions as a synonym for critically endangered, suggesting that a species is near to being extinguished or near to the brink of life itself. And while I'm certainly interested in what pushes non-human lives to the brink, I'm more invested in expanding the implications of the term near extinction as one that captures entire modes of life, whether they are considered endangered or not, and how they operate amidst ecological precarity. So put in kind of simple terms, if popular extinction discourses hinge on a kind of climate catastrophism, in which extinction is mostly conceived of as the final death of a species, then I propose the term near-extinction narratives to signify a form of literary writing that reframes extinction as part of a larger intergenerational and interspecies trajectory. So this is where I turn to the work of Kerry Hume, a Maori novelist, poet, and short story writer. Engaging with Stonefish, an experimental collection of short stories and poetry published in 2004, I argue that Hume not only explores how climate change destroys local ecologies on Aotearoa's Te Waipunamu or New Zealand's South Island, but highlights her character's abilities, both human and non-human, to adapt to a world increasingly in flux. Today, I'll be focusing on the collection's opening short story, which is a narrative called Floating Words. Even though Floating Words never witnesses or documents an extinction event, I interpret it as a near-extinction narrative because of its depictions of species adaptation amidst ecological disaster. While many extinction narratives choose to focus on large-bodied, charismatic megafauna, so think polar bears, giant pandas, elephants, or tigers, Floating Words is really exceptional because it illustrates our connectedness as humans to a historically invisibilized and underrepresented taxonomic category: fungi. Set on the coast of New Zealand's South Island, the story follows a solitary mushroom forager, an unnamed female protagonist of Maori descent, as she harvests a peculiar-looking fungus at the beginning of the narrative. We then follow this story as the protagonist and her newly foraged mushroom learn to survive New Zealand's rising tides together. By examining this human-fungus relationship, I argue that Floating Words remains attentive to the ordinary ruptures that ecological crises involve, in which its characters, as a mode of survival, must learn to adapt to an ever-shifting seascape. As is hopefully clear then, Floating Words is interested in three key concerns: survival, crisis, and most crucially for the purposes of today's discussion, adaptation. Hume envisions a dystopian world where New Zealand's South Island has emerged as its very own floating world, where human communities relocate from their terrestrial homes on the land to what the protagonist describes as bubble houses. These are effectively strange-looking domes that loom out of the mist, half submerged in water. As the narrator reflects, change, change, change. Where is solidity? Where is the rock? Now, this observation isn't only referring to the solidity of New Zealand's land, which is being transformed by ongoing sea level rise, but it also anticipates real-world projects favoured by Silicon Valley elites today, what is being referred to as seasteading, and this is just taken from the seasteading website. Seasteading is an initiative where permanent floating cities are built in the ocean, unregulated and independent of governments. And I don't have the space to kind of delve into the politics of seasteading today, but it is certainly curious that Hume's 2004 short story could envision the concept of floating cities, which in contemporary times has become a form of venture capitalism, where these elite tech bros attempt to push the limits of land-bound affairs using the Pacific Ocean. Of course, here we can see resonances with Trina's discussion of discourses of vulnerability and extinction threat. But in this case, the so-called passive subjects are actually Pacific Islanders whose homes are deemed inevitably doomed and thus available for these outlandish capitalist ventures. Interestingly, in the story, Floating Words, not only are humans being displaced into these more watery realms, but so too are non-human creatures, in particular fungi species. In fact, that strange mushroom that Hume's protagonist forages at the beginning of the story begins to mutate throughout. Its ever-mutating morphology becomes central to the plot, acting as a sign of rising sea levels and ultimately prompting the narrator to leave her home. As she writes, "I had grown used to the basket mycelium, grown used to the violent coloration, but now the fungus is glowing with minute blue sine waves moving up the stalk as the tide rises. It is the tide in microcosm, the whole cap becoming alight at slackwater. I recognise a sign when I'm given one so clearly." Over the months, the fungus has not shriveled or decayed, but extraordinarily spread its mycelium through the basket that the protagonist put it in at the beginning of the story. Now, mycelium is the root-like structure of a fungus, depicted here in the right-hand corner of the screen. It acts as a kind of subterranean network of thread-like filaments called hyphae, which are fundamental for nutrient absorption and growth. By spreading its mycelium into the basket, the fungus adapts to its changing environment. It not only survives without any connection to the land, but it also becomes a temporal indicator of rapidly rising sea levels. Its gradual change in coloration, when it begins to emanate these blue sine waves, becomes interpreted by the narrator as a clear sign that she should leave her home. But what the narrator finds most disconcerting here is the mushroom's ability to adapt to sea level rise, something that she, as a human being, struggles to do herself. Arguably less vulnerable than her, this mushroom creates a new home in the basket, averting near extinction altogether. This image of the mushroom as an agent of resilience amidst ecological disaster is particularly important. As Trina pointed out, it's necessary to reframe communities affected by climate change, not as passive, vulnerabilized victims, but as agents within their own right. In Floating Words, Hume certainly carries this sentiment, but begins to redirect our focus from the human altogether, encouraging us to recognize agency in the environment, in the more than human realm. The vision of the mutating mushroom, then, seems to be more in dialogue with Anna Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World, where she observes how Matsuzaki mushrooms thrive in blasted landscapes, such as the industrial forest ruins of Japan and the USA. But this sentiment of fungal resilience and adaptation takes on a broader significance in what we refer to as the fungal imaginary. Often looming in apocalyptic horror genres, mushrooms have historically been represented as survivors in the face of catastrophe, able to endure conditions that would otherwise be disastrous to other species, including our own. The films and TV shows on the slide here all play into these very anthropocentric fears that our time on Earth is running out, demonizing fungi species as objects of horror that will inevitably catalyze our destruction. Now, the underlying source of dread that drive these cultural media is what Stefan Scrimshire refers to as the apocalyptic obverse. This is basically getting at the idea that the world will come to an end. Not that the world will come to an end, but that life will continue in a world without us. In Floating Words, I argue, Hume exemplifies this apocalyptic obverse, not to produce a cautionary tale of human finitude, but to shift this fungal imaginary from one of horror and catastrophe to potentially one of resilience and promise. In the floating world of New Zealand, our narrator might be increasingly disconnected from other humans who now live in their isolated bubble homes, but through the ordinary practices of mushroom foraging, she is actually brought closer to and increasingly dependent upon the non-human. Now, Hume is not suggesting here that we need a sense of shared vulnerability to cultivate any affinity with the non-human. Rather, she implies that with a willingness to learn from the non-human, we might move towards becoming what Merlin Sheldrake refers to as cooperative mutualists with the more than human realm. In an otherwise grey landscape increasingly taken over by rising sea levels, the tide bolete, which is what the protagonist renames the mushroom as though it were its own species, is symbolically imbued with significance. It becomes allied to the narrator throughout the story, extending its roots and mycelium throughout the basket as she too adapts to a rising tide. As the narrator explains, hyphae is delicate and exceedingly vulnerable to changes in moisture or light. Although they are brainless organisms then, Hume depicts mushrooms as very lively and dynamic creatures, vulnerable to climatological changes, but adaptable according to external sensory input. This attentiveness to fungal agency and dynamism in the story expands the registers of the fungal imaginary I mentioned earlier. Both the narrator and the mushroom are subject to the currents of the Tasman Sea, and thus both creatures must adapt to impermanence. Thriving in its new basket home while also encouraging the narrator's departure, this mutating mushroom paves the way for human to non-human affinity in the narrative. In other words, the narrator and the mushroom forge an unlikely alliance with one another, accepting the fact that nothing is static, settled, or permanent before drifting away on the protagonist's homemade boat. Allied not to the human but to the non-human in this new world, the story ends with a vision of the protagonist as her own agent, which, like the mushroom, she becomes a figure of free motion, able to drift autonomously between the tides. To conclude then, and in line with what I conceptualize to be the near-extinction genre, Floating Words does not simply portray a world in ecological crisis. It narrativizes our connectedness to non-human creatures and, crucially, leaves the reader wondering about new ways of being in a world where our ecologies are being irrevocably altered.
Our talks today were entitled Extinction and its Discontents. In living up to our billing, I hope we have troubled the word extinction a little for you and thought about its implications. We wanted to close just with saying that our aim has not been to prescribe a particular understanding of extinction and the climate crisis, but rather to encourage us all to critically look at how we currently talk about and respond to them. We hope to have foregrounded some stories which perhaps need to be told in order to cultivate what might be a more just and equitable way of engaging with the idea of extinction. Thank you very much.